Hey guys, tonight we descend into the rank, gritty, and gloriously awful world of medieval labor. A time when your job title said less about your career path and more about your risk of plague and burns. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. I used to believe there was an art to choosing one's life, that somehow we select the work that shapes us. But my first winter in the city taught me the truth. Sometimes the work chooses you, and it grips you with both hands. I learned this on a moon-bitten night behind a row of timber houses, where the alley narrowed to a crooked spine, and the air was thick with secrets. My coin was gone, and my luck was thinner than gruel, and the only door that opened for me creaked on rusted hinges and smelled of ammonia and shame. This is how I became a night man, and how I learned that the worst jobs have a way of finding your soft parts and hardening them or leaving them scarred. They called him Hob the Picker, and he leaned on a pole as tall as a gallows and sized me up like he was weighing a carcass. "You got lungs?" he asked. I nodded. "You got legs?" I nodded again. "And you got no pride?" I hesitated, but it turned out that didn't matter. He pressed a rag of vinegar to my nose and tied a rope round my waist like I was a stubborn cow. "Right," Hobbs said and shoved the shovel into my hand. "Tonight you're a gong farmer. Don't let the word fool you. There's no farm, only pits. There's no gong, only what drops." At first, I thought the stink itself would split me in two. You learn to breathe shallow, to hum in your throat without words, just a rhythm to keep you moving. Step, scrape, lift, pass. We went from house to house under cover of night, lifting the heavy boards that sealed the privies, dropping into the holes like grave robbers. Hobbs' lantern threw a sleepy gold across the brick edges, and the shadows formed little quivering kingdoms. He worked the pole, I worked the shovel, and a third man hoisted the slopping buckets with a steady clack of rope against wood, his silhouette shivering in the lantern light like a dancing saint. "Mind the pockets," Hobbs said, nodding to the muck as if it were a library. "People drop coins. Rings, whole knives sometimes. There's treasure in filth, if you've got the hands for it." He laughed softly, not unkind. "But don't get greedy. Greed will pull you under faster than the stink." By the halfway house, I had learned the trick of leaning my weight against my knees so my back would thank me in the morning. I had learned how to brace my boots on the slippery brick and how to read Hobbs' breath before he spoke. Mostly, I learned how quickly folk look away. You become invisible in this work, which is a sort of mercy until you realize you miss being seen. We rolled the barrels to the city edge, where our mule snorted, offended on principle. The night air there tasted almost sweet, and stars peered down like pinholes through a velvet cloak. We tipped the load into a trench that would feed the fields come spring, and didn't talk much on the walk back. Hob clapped my shoulder when we finished, his palm rough as bark. "You didn't run," he said. "That's worth coin." Come back tomorrow if your pride's still dead. I did, because hunger bites louder than pride. The winter softened into mud season, and the mud made waiting easy, and the easy turned to hazard. I learned this on the second week, when our fourth man lost his footing, slipped off the pit ladder, and went in up to his chest with a wet sound I still hear in my sleep. Hob moved like a striking cat, rope already looped to the crossbeam. But the worst part was the silence from the lad, while we hauled him up. Not a curse, not a sob. Once he was on the cobbles, he shook like a dog and stared at the moon with wide, white eyes. We stripped him to his skin and poured buckets of well water over him, and Hob made him drink a sour ale with a raw egg cracked into it, for strength or superstition. It hardly matters which when you're that cold. The next night, he didn't come back. No one blamed him. If you've never felt the floor go out from beneath you in a place where the walls are made of other people's forgetting, perhaps you're lucky, or perhaps you just haven't lived long enough. I lasted as long as my hands did. The lime burns took their shot at me first, tiny angry mouths along my wrists where the bucket brine licked my skin. Then there were the headaches, the way your temples throb when you've breathed too much of the fermenting night. The worst was the way it settled into your clothes and hair. There's no escaping what you carry home. The children would pinch their noses when I passed, and the dogs decided I was interesting enough to follow, and then, upon closer acquaintance, uninteresting enough to abandon. If I ever dreamed of glory, that time burned it down and left me with the ash of competence. I learned to do a hard thing, night after night, and be grateful for the pay. But I also learned that the city has a job for every fool who can take a dare. And I am nothing if not brave when the cupboards are empty. When the thaw came and the marsh woke up, I found myself standing knee-deep in the reed beds, shivering in a fog that tasted like pennies. "Hold still," Maeve said, a woman with forearms like willow roots and a basket of glass jars strung across her hip. They liked the warm parts best. I glanced down at my legs, which were goose-pimpled and red. "Leech collecting," she told me, as if it were a fancy game. "You'll feel them at first, then not at all. Cuts the world into two feelings, before and after the numb." She smacked one blood-swollen leech off her shin and popped it in a jar. "Don't yank. You salt them or you coax them. Don't make a leech angry. They don't forget where the feast lives. The first bite is a surprise like a fish darting through your palm. The second bite is a lesson. The third is surrender." We stood there in the half-light with frogs grumbling their complaints and the reeds whispering like a gossiping choir. And the leeches found us, and we plucked them off alive into jars, and the jars went to the barber surgeon in exchange for copper coins, and once, gloriously, a heel of brown bread soaked in soup. Maeve taught me how to bind your calves with cloth to slow the drain, and how to wrap a belt tight when you've miscounted the suckers and feel weak. When I swayed, she gripped my elbow. "Bend your knees," she said. "You're a tree in wind, not a tower." Towers fall. We delivered the brimming jars to a man named Cuthbert, whose shop smelled of iron and wine and old wood. If you've never met a barber surgeon, picture a butcher and a priest who share the same apron. He had a good laugh, and it boomed in the little room when he tipped our jars into his stone basin. "Bless you both and your brave ankles," he said. "The gentry have headaches, and the monks have humors that need balancing. Come back Tuesday. Bring more." He tossed Maeve a coin and me a nod, and that was the measure of our partnership. The best part of leeching was the sky. I say that with a straight face. When the dawn pulled itself out of the damp and wrung out light over the fields, the color was pure forgiveness. You could stand there with your calves tulip-striped in red and not feel poor for a breath or two. On the way home, we'd pass by the tanner's quarter, and the wind would fail us, and the smell would take us whole. My work there came on a day when Maeve said she'd had enough of losing blood for the week and wanted to feel like she was earning her wage by hitting something. The tanner's yard is where smell becomes a presence you could argue with. If the gong pits whisper, the tanner's yard shouts. Hides hung like flayed banners from wooden racks, and vats sat fat and secretive in rows like squat priests. The master, a patient man with a face folded into permanent concentration, showed me the stones used to dehair skins, the lime baths that chewed everything they touched, and the piles of dung that came to us like offerings from the city's dog-laden corners. A boy called a pure finder arrived dragging a sack twice his size, and the master tossed him a coin without looking, the way you'd toss a treat to a dog. The boy vanished, and I envied him wherever he went. "Hands," the master said, nodding to a vat, "strong ones." He showed me how to stir the hides with a paddle half as tall as me, how to lift one edge with a hooked pole to test for readiness, how to scrape with a knife so sharp it didn't forgive mistakes. The hides fought back. Slime slapped my wrists, and my eyes watered, and the master pressed a slice of onion into my hand. "Keep it in your mouth," he commanded. "Cuts the smell." It made my tongue burn and my nose run, and somehow it did help. A little. If there's an art to tanning, it's patience mixed with stubbornness. You wait. You stir. You scrape. You rinse. You wait again. The days slipped past, and the yard's thudding rhythms etched themselves into me. The apprentice next to me, a wry girl with a lopsided braid who could outwork 3 boys and outriddle anybody, told me she slept without dreams. "Because the dreams get jealous," she said, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "The yard gives me enough." Her name was Nell, and she could spit with accuracy into a knothole from 4 paces. At noon we shared a crust of bread, and she taught me to judge when skin gives up its secrets. "The edge tells it," she said, pinching a hide, "like reading lips." When the wind settled wrong, the neighbors complained, but not to our faces. You cannot banish a stink with a petition. The river carried away our waste like a patient mother, and downstream the fishermen muttered curses, and then returned to their nets. I learned that every clean thing in the market had dirt stitched into its seams. The leather that bound a book of theology had passed through dung and lime and blistered hands before ever touching a scholar's desk. It made me oddly tender toward all finished things. I wanted to tell the next nobleman who bought a flawless pair of boots what we had done for his stride. When the harvest failed, the worst work found me again. It came shy this time. disguised as the simple need to keep warm. A charcoal burner named Lark took me into the woods with a cart and a nod, and we built a mound like a sleeping hill. We stacked billets of wood into a cone, covered it with turf and damp earth until it looked like a buried giant, and then we opened its throat to the smallest flame and sealed the smoke inside with care. My job was to watch. Charcoal burning is a lesson in patience, even more than tanning, and a lesson in quiet terror besides. If the smoke is too thin, you feed air. If it's too fat, you seal tighter. If you get it wrong, your week's labor vanishes into a heap of gray ash that mocks you. Lark had a way of reading the color, like a shepherd reads the sky. He could stand with his arms folded, cock his head, and decide our next move. He moved as if he heard something I could not, as if the mound hummed to him in a language older than words. We slept in a lean-to that smelled of damp and sap, and our clothes absorbed the ash until we matched the woodcutters out of some cautionary tale. Sometimes travelers would peer through the trees, cross themselves, and skirt us as if we were sprites, or worse. On the third night, the wind changed, and a spark found a seam, and the mound flamed from its heart outward. Lark swore once, softly, and we worked like devils. We slapped wet turf over the breach with our bare hands, and the steam scalded us until we tasted copper in our mouths. It held. The mound sulked itself back to a smoky calm. Lark laughed after, as if we'd wrestled something bigger than both of us and survived through luck. "The trick is to lose as little as you can," he said, and I stored that away because it felt like it applied to more than charcoal. By then, I had decided I'd try any job once, a foolish principle that inflation soon adjusted. The plague arrived like a muffled drumbeat you pretend you don't hear. At first it was whispers in the tavern. Then it was the sight of a shutter nailed at a crooked angle across a familiar door. Then it was a bell that rang too often in the morning. Work shifted again. The city needed diggers. I'm not proud to say I took the pay without looking the foreman in the eye. There are days you make bargains with your future self. Forgive me now, and I'll make it up to you later. We dug pits where the ground allowed and the water table was lazy. We dug in silence, the kind that settles in throats like wool. The carts came at dusk. There are no words for that part that don't feel like stealing. I remember the sky, always the sky, as if it stayed ordinary on purpose, blue and indifferent, while everything under it went thin and strange. We sprinkled lime for mercy or superstition. We snatched our food at arm's length. We did not sing. I lasted a week, and then fled to the edge of the city where the laundresses worked by the river, thinking that soap would save me. It didn't, but their laughing did. I scrubbed linen until my knuckles bled, and learned how to angle a board so the river's chatter did half my work. The women led me like a stray they had adopted, and I kept my head down and listened to their bright, sharp talk, which cut the heaviness and stitched us together in some small defiance. One of them, a widow with eyes that didn't miss, made me eat hot broth and told me I had a look like a tree that survived too many winters. "You can keep growing," she said, or you can break. There's no standing still. I needed someone to tell me something that's simple and true. The work that found me next was as old as sin, and twice as secret. The church needed a hand that didn't mind being unblessed. An old sacristan who'd once chased me away from the granary with a stick now beckoned me in and offered coin to carry baskets of bones from a crumbling shrine to a new crypt, carefully, reverently, like a procession through time. We walked at night so the pious wouldn't ask questions we couldn't answer, and I learned the quiet weight of history, the way a fragment of skull sits so lightly in a palm and yet feels full as a bell. My companion, a man whose beard held more breadcrumbs than his larder, told me stories as we walked. He made the saints into neighbors and the relics into cousins. Someone made these shelves, he'd say, brushing dust from stone. Someone set these stones and thought, good, that's enough for now. The work taught me a softer kind of patience, the kind that sits with what's broken and doesn't try to fix it into something it's not. But the worst jobs have a scent for you, the way wolves can find the softest sheep. On a market day that smelled of onions and horses, a rat catcher pressed a forked stick into my hand and grinned as if he'd given me a key to a secret society. They breed faster than greed, he said. We'll never be out of work. Isn't that comforting? His name was Parson, which he'd earned not for piety, but for the way he could sermonize about traps. Together we crawled into cellars where the air was thick with grain dust and chewing sounds. He taught me how to stroke the stick along the floor, how to place a baited pot so it felt like part of the room, how to move slow enough to be a roomer and then fast enough to be a stone wall. The first time a rat tried to dart past me and I blocked it with my ankle, I felt like the hero of some minor legend. The first time one bit me, I felt like a fool with a bandage and no tetanus in the vocabulary to name my fear. Parson carried a battered sack with a cat in it, and the cat was the only creature I met that year who thought we were all ridiculous. I respected her for that. We traded rat tails to the city clerk for a coin, a dozen, and I wondered what a clerk did with such currency. You don't ask too many questions in a year like that. You simply count your copper and eat your stew and try not to dream of scratching. The tavern keeper's wife started leaving a bowl of something hot near the back door when she saw me pass, and each time I lifted it, I felt my chest loosen a little, as if kindness were muscle relaxant. I made a game of naming the jobs I hadn't tried, as if making a list could conjure a future. Chandler's helper. I could ruin 1,000 candles. Lime burner. The Burns would accept me as kin. Gravedigger I had been. Gong farmer, too. I told myself I'd say no next time, and then I said yes. The fuller's mill lives where the river slaps itself thin, over a drop, and then gathers its skirts for another run. They needed a strong back, and I had one left. If you've never watched wet cloth turn into sturdy fabric, imagine a river teaching wool how to stand upright. We pounded it with wooden hammers and our own feet, and we fed the mill like a beast, and we poured in stale urine like a witch's ingredient because it stripped the grease and made the fibers cling. No one said that part in polite company, but the buckets told the truth. The mill sang a monotonous song that was easy to follow and hard to forget. My legs ached a new ache, a straightforward one that felt like honest labor. I preferred it. There's a difference between the ache you choose and the ache that chooses you. The mill offered the first for a time. We made jokes to outpace the stink. We invented heroes who could knock a bolt of cloth into grace with one stomp. We bet each other bread on which side of the cloth would finish smoother, and learned to keep our fingers safe under those hammers, because a hand can go from yours to the mill's in a blink. On afternoons when sunlight hit the spray just right, it looked like the air was lit from within, and for a few minutes I forgot everything but the shimmer. Nell, who'd left the tanners for the fullers because she'd had her fill of hides, worked across from me and threatened to outpace me, which she often did. And we laughed whenever we both stumbled at the same moment, as if a trickster god had tugged our ankles. We slept hard and woke with the taste of lye and salt at the back of our throats, and did it again. If you're keeping score, at this point in my life, I was a man-sized drawer full of odd tools and stranger smells, and I had cheerfully mislaid every idea I'd ever had about destiny. It turns out that a city is not a single creature. It is a swarm, and the swarm needs keepers and schleppers and scrapers and sifters. The work doesn't feel like history when you're doing it. It feels like the next thing in line. But there were moments, small ones, always small, when I felt a door opening, not to a grand life, but to a certain clarity. Like the night on the bridge when a stonemason leaned his back against me while we hefted a lintel into place, and he breathed steady, and I thought, this is what it means to be a hinge. Or the morning I held my hands over hot tallow to shape a wick and felt, absurdly, like a magician conjuring light. There's a nobility that slips into you sideways when you aren't looking. Then I met the executioner's man, and the world tried to teach me something harsher. He was a quiet fellow, with hands like paddles, and a patience that could wear down granite. He found me through a chain of acquaintances you wouldn't sketch on paper. "We need someone who doesn't faint," he said, and looked at me with the softest, saddest eyes. "Mostly we clean. Mostly we fetch. Mostly we stand where others won't. The coin was good. People will pay for their fear to be contained." The first day I swept a platform until the wood grain glowed. I wiped down the blade like it was a holy thing and laid a cloth over it, because a blade needs dignity too, according to the man who trained me. "Names are for priests," he said, not unkind. "Our work is quieter." No one spoke to us in the square, but I felt the weight of their stares like raindrops. Children gawked until their mothers tugged them away. They say you are what you do, but sometimes you are what people imagine you do, and that is a different sentence entirely. I lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sweeping, of carrying, of being a wall. Not much blood touched my hands, and yet it felt like it was on me all the time, an invisible dye. When I passed the laundresses, they'd nod, and I'd nod, and we'd both look at the river instead of each other. Nell saw me one evening and didn't wave. That hurt more than I could say. After the 3rd week, I laid the paddle-handed man's apron on the bench and told him I was not built for that kind of quiet. He clasped my forearm. "Few are," he said, and the softness in him did me in. I walked out with my head down and went to find an honest stink to cover a different kind. There was always lime to be slaked, always mortar to be mixed, always small jobs that needed a spine and 2 hands. I turned my shoulder to a mason's wheel. I held a lantern for a scribe, while he catalogued church treasures that were more mouse-nibbled wood than relic. I perched in a bell tower and hauled a rope until my palms blistered and my ears rang for days. The city below looked like a toy, and I felt bigger than I was. The bell's voice rolled out over rooftops, and there was a second, only a second, where it felt like the city and I were saying one thing together at the top of our lungs. But the worst job I ever took in that season, worse than the pits and the leeches, worse even than the 3 weeks of quiet, was one that seemed humble and harmless at first. I became a rooster. It happened because the watchman overslept. In our lane there was a man whose job was to carry the hours like a musician carries a tune. He'd call the time. He'd check the locks. He'd make his rounds with a staff that tapped the cobbles like a heartbeat. He came down with a fever one week, and the baker asked me if I'd fill in. "You're up anyway," she said, which was true. I was up because sleep felt like a treacherous friend lately. So I walked the dark while the city held its breath, and I called out the hours in a voice that surprised me by its depth. And I found that the sound of your own voice on empty streets is both companion and judge. People listened for me, and that was new. They lit their lamps when I said it was time. And the baker opened her oven, and the midwife checked on a widow, and the cobbler rolled his bad ankle and cursed me affectionately for reminding him of the dawn. The harmless part ended when I knocked on a door that wouldn't answer. The husband had left 3 days before to find work in another town, and the neighbors heard me call the hour and pointed in a way that asked a question without words. I pushed on the boards with the back of my knuckles and waited. No sound. I knocked again and put my ear to the crack and heard something that wasn't a cry and wasn't silence. I fetched the midwife. Between us we opened the door. I will say only that we did what we could, and that the midwife, whom I had always seen as a small, fierce bird, became a general that night, and I her apprentice. The dawn found us on the stoop, with our hands in our laps, and a bowl of water cooling at our feet. When the watchman returned, I gave him back his staff like someone handing over a sword after losing a battle you couldn't win. The baker left a loaf by my door, shaped like a crescent moon. I ate it slowly and didn't taste it, and that was how I knew I needed a different kind of work altogether for a while. I went to the road. The countryside doesn't care who you've been. It asks only that you move. I traded my city stink for the perfume of manure and wet hay, and the raw green of unbothered grass. I walked with a peddler for a week and learned the litany of wares he could recite in his sleep. Needles and ribbons and pins and stories. He'd hold up a comb carved like a fish and sell it with a joke, then trade a tale for a cup of beer, then sleep with his back against his cart and one foot hooked through a spoke for safety. He said, "The worst job is the one that eats your dreams." And I believed him because I'd started waking in the middle of the night with my heart pounding as if it had remembered a fall I hadn't taken. He also said, "If you can make someone laugh while they hand you money, you've accomplished a holy thing." And I believed that too. We crossed a bridge so new the mortar still smelled like summer. We ducked under a gallows where birds congregated as if it were just another tree. We passed through a village where the women bred dogs smaller than cats and priced them higher than cows. We found work mending a stone wall that had slumped like a tired man, and the farmer paid us with onions and a praise that went right to my hungry core. In a meadow, I watched a thatcher at work and fell in love for an hour with his method, the way he smoothed the oaten bundles under his flatting tool until the roof looked like a sleeping animal. I thought then that perhaps I'd found a decent craft, one that smelled of rain and smoked under stars, and I asked if he needed a pair of willing hands. So I learned to thatch. The bundles, it's always bundles in every trade, must be combed and even. The ridgeline must be strict as a schoolmaster, and the marsh reed will cut your palms if you don't charm it first. I climbed ladders until my thighs sang, bent with a hook knife between my teeth like a pirate of roofs, and set scallops of hazel as neat as any soldier. The family below moved through their rooms under our work like fish in a pond, oblivious to the manufacture of their weather. When we finished, the thatch shone in the low sun like a lion's back. The farmer's wife touched it lovingly and cried as if the house itself had come home. The thatcher took his pay and slipped me an extra onion because I had learned to hold a line true. He said, "You'll never go hungry, not if you can do that." I tucked the onion into my bag like a jewel. If you think this sounds too pleasant for a tale of the worst jobs, it is only because the world is not a tidy thing. Good work appears sometimes in the same week as the worst, and you make do with both. On the road back toward the city, a storm cracked the sky open, and we sheltered in an old lime kiln that had seen better fires. The rain came sideways, and then from every direction at once, and for an hour I laughed like a fool because there was nothing else for it. The ruined kiln smelled of ghosts and chalk. I traced the old scorch marks with my thumb and felt a yearning I couldn't name, something like envy for the men who'd stood here when it was alive, who'd fed it and soothed it with water and tamed it with care. I realized then that I had started to love the places where things transform, no matter the cost. Pits, vats, kilns, mills. Structures that take a thing in and return it altered. Perhaps that is all a job is, a transformation you agree to undergo repeatedly until you recognize yourself less by your face and more by the tools your hands reach for in the dark. So I returned with my onion and my new calluses, and the city took me in like a hearth that hasn't been cleaned in a long while. Work waits. It doesn't sleep. It just blinks. In the square, a crew called for someone to turn a great wheel in a workshop whose windows sweated with steam. Treadmill, they told me, showing me a contraption big enough to shame any hamster. Animals gone lame. We need a man to be the mule. I stepped into the thing, because I don't always say no when I should, and the pupils of the foreman shrank to dots as he watched me test the weight. When the gears bit and the belts moved, the whole room came alive. Saws and pulleys, something that stamped and something that hissed. My job was walking, and then walking harder, and then walking beyond that into a kind of thinking that uses your calves for punctuation. I watched a young man feed wood into the saw and pull it out-shaped. Watched an old woman at a bench stitch leather with a speed that made her age a rumor. I walked and walked, and when I stumbled, the wheel took its revenge, and I learned where a bruise can flower behind a kneecap. When I slept that night, I dreamed I was a mouse inside a cathedral clock, and my job was to keep the time by chewing. I woke with teeth sore from clenching and decided I preferred dirt to gears, the moon to lanterns, hands to wheels. Everyone prefers something. Preference will not always save you, but it helps you make choices in a life that seems made of everyone else's decisions. A messenger found me in the morning with sloppy boots and news that tasted like old pennies. Hob had taken sick. Hob of the pits. Hob of the vinegar rag and the big laugh. I took my onion and my feet and went to him. He lay propped like a lord on a pile of cloaks, and some jokester had tied a ribbon to his pole. His eyes lit when I ducked under the lintel. "You still got lungs?" he rasped. I held up the onion like a talisman, and he cackled until he coughed. "I taught you good," he said when he caught his wind. "You never come back empty-handed." We talked until he slept, and when his breath evened out, I stepped outside and leaned against his door and realized that the worst jobs share one thing with the best. They bind you to people you wouldn't have met otherwise, and sometimes that binding is what holds the roof on your life. Late in the year, when the day shortened and the shadows lengthened like cats, I stood on the edge of the river with a bucket and a brush. A man with ink on his fingers had hired me to help clean a set of wooden types for a press he'd purchased from a foreign city, where printers talked like magicians and argued like kings. He spoke of letters like soldiers, spacing like fleets, margins like a treaty. "Words can multiply," he told me, and his grin made him look like a boy caught stealing apples. Imagine that. Multiplying words, I held a letter A between two fingers and felt, for one ridiculous second, that I was holding the edge of a future. I thought of all the people whose hands had found the worst work and made something of it anyway. People who turned muck into fields and hides into leather and wool into cloth and night into morning. I thought of my ledger of scars and how each one spelled out a lesson. I thought of me with my onion and my hard-won humor, who had learned how to stand in a pit and in a river and on a roof and still look up at the sky like it belonged to me. I can tell you about more jobs and worse ones. I can tell you about the sin-eater who sat at the edge of the village and swallowed bread over the cold chest of the unloved, taking on a burden no one wanted to admit to, and how his eyes looked like winter water. I can tell you about the bellows boy in the smithy who learned to keep the air right or risk a forge, spitting like an angered god. I can tell you about the bead maker who breathed in dust that glittered on its way to killing him, and about the woman who plucked geese until her arms sang and her back turned into a map of knots. I can tell you about the lime man who lost 3 teeth to a cough and kept laughing anyway, and about the ferryman who rowed his boat through fog thick enough to steal whole hours. But those are chapters, and I have given you a beginning. A beginning is just a sturdy handle. Take hold of it. The world will pull. Let it. Your hands will learn. Your lungs will prove themselves. Your pride will loosen its grip and then return not as arrogance, but as a quiet certainty that you can do the next needed thing. And when someone asks if you've got lungs, you'll know enough to answer with a question of your own. Is there work that needs doing? Then I suppose I do. I promised you the rest. And if there's one thing I've learned while hauling the world's refuse and rinsing its conscience, it's that a promise is a tool like any other. It holds weight, and it fits in the hand if you reach for it. So here is the part where the seasons shift their coats, where the smell of the vat gives way to the salt of the sea and the soot of new chimneys, where the story keeps choosing me, even as I try to choose it. The man with ink on his fingers introduced me to a word that rattled around my skull for weeks. Saltpeter. He said it the way a monk might say mercy. The powder needs it, he told me, glancing over his shoulder, as if gunpowder itself were a sensitive neighbor. You scrape it from the damp where the world sweats. Cellars' stables, old vaults. The government pays, in coin that doesn't stink. That last part was a lie. Coin carries every smell of every palm it has touched. But I went anyway, because the work turned out to be the old work in a new suit. Darkness, damp, and a rope around the waist. We went at night, a pair of ghosts with scrapers and sacks. You learn to see with your fingers in places like that. The walls had a crust like sugar, except it wasn't sugar unless you were a fool or a death-wisher, and I was neither that weak. We'd wet the crust and coax it free, and the scrapings piled like a small snowfall in the sack, while the lantern made the crystals wink like stars that had lost their way. My partner, a quiet man named Bryn, with a laugh like a dropped pebble, had an even quieter dog who waited at the cellar stairs and refused to descend, which showed he was the wisest among us. Mind your lungs, Bryn would say, and I'd hum to keep them obedient. We paid the stablemen under the table to look the other way while we scraped their walls. And once a farmer's wife brought us a cup of hot milk with a finger of spirit in it, and I drank it too fast and nearly sneezed a flame. We handed our sacks to a foreman with a ledger that never quite balanced, even when his grin did. And for a few weeks, I trod the strange edge between the old world and a noisier one. The powder went somewhere secret. Smoke came from somewhere else. And the sky stayed indifferent. I wasn't built for secrecy. It gets into your bones worse than damp. So I slipped away and found myself on a dock where the planks had been repaired so often you could trace the history of boots by their different hammer strokes. The sea lifted its shoulders and sighed as if it had misplaced a kingdom and couldn't be bothered to look. "Can you work a pump?" the bosun asked. I looked down at my arms and lied with confidence. "Aye." He put me on bilge duty, and I learned more than I ever wanted to know about the underside of ships. If you've never been a pump man, imagine walking in place through a storm while holding a conversation with the worst water in the world. The bilge doesn't smell like the sea. It smells like everything that has ever dripped or fallen or made a bad decision, cooled and conspired. You stand there with your hands on the long handles, and your shoulders find a rhythm with the waves, and your mind goes to a place where it can keep from noticing your feet, which have become cousins to prunes. The pump answers you in a steady wheeze. "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." The crew take turns cursing the ocean affectionately, like an uncle who borrows money and always pays late. At night, I lay in my hammock and listened to the wood complain in a language I almost understood. We chased whales for a season, though I pretend we were just chasing a horizon, because the truth sits wrong in the mouth. The try-works burned in the belly of the ship like a forge, and the smoke climbed into the sky and returned as grime on our faces. I learned that fire at sea is a special kind of arrogance humans practice when they're tired and hungry and paid by the barrel. The heat had teeth, and the smell had hands. The cook leaned out of his galley on a day when the smoke came back and settled like a second skin and shouted, "At least we'll never catch cold." He was the sort of fool I like, the kind who makes you laugh when you're too chapped to smile. I left at the next harbor. Some part of me understood I was not built to carry a flame that far from shore. I took my pay in coin and regret and slept on land that didn't sway for a week. When I woke, I found the old habit waiting, a city's underbelly with its hidden currents. By then, the city had a new set of veins. Not rivers and alleys, but tunnels the engineers called sewers, with a pride they hadn't earned yet. The old filth learned new tricks, and men like me learned new words for the same old tasks. Toshing, they called it, and if that sounds like a cousin of gong farming, it was. Except the cousins had developed a taste for adventure and poor decisions. We strapped candles to our hats so we'd have both hands, and the tally of hazards included gases that could set your beard alight or quietly send you to sleep in the worst bed imaginable. We tied lines to our waist as someone always has in places that prefer their secrets kept. My guide was Long Tom, who wasn't tall at all, but had a way of standing that made you think of mass and straight roads. His candle never seemed to shrink, no matter how long we wandered, which made me suspect the wind had a soft spot for him. Treasure and filth, same story, new setting. Coins bright enough to make you forget caution. Trinkets that had slipped lives and wanted a second chance. Long Tom taught me how to listen for water that sounded wrong, deeper than it should be, the sort that heralds a tide returning with opinions. He taught me to smell the air with my tongue, like a lizard for signs of gas, to crouch when in doubt, to trust a good rope more than a good man if forced to choose. Once we found a gold chain nestled in muck like a snake, and we laughed ourselves airy on the way out. Two kings of the worst kingdom. A week later, a man we knew by his coughing went in ahead of us and did not come out. We put away our ropes and sat in the market where the living air tasted like cabbage and smoke, and pretended we were on a holiday. I left the tunnels that day because you can only carry so many ghosts before your back complains. I tried the shore again, but from the other side. Mudlarking sounds like a game children would invent, and perhaps it is, for children who are born with old eyes. You walk the river's edge at the lowest tide, and you let the water pick its teeth in front of you. It spits up pins and bottles and bones and secrets. You learn the map of cuts on your fingers the way a sailor learns stars. In winter, the cold turns your hands into uncooperative citizens. I loved the quiet of it, the way the city sounded far away even when its towers leaned in to eavesdrop. I loved it until I found a knife with a crust on it that wasn't rust. And then I went home and pointed my boots at a different street. There are jobs that look like jokes until you try them. Sweeping chimneys seemed one of those, until I found myself in a black throat that narrowed without warning, and found out what panic sounds like when it can't find air to carry it. I didn't send children. I was not built to stomach that. The master sweep looked at me as if I were a misguided saint, and shrugged so hard his shoulders nearly took flight. Your lungs, he warned. Your knees. Your courage. I gave him all three and climbed with my brush and my stubbornness and learned the sensation of soot becoming part of your thoughts. There's a moment when you're wedged 3 stories up and your shoulders are complaining and your foot has nothing to say to you, and you realize your heartbeat is a drum trying to send an army into battle. You learn not to scratch your face until you crawl back into daylight, because otherwise you'll carry 2 new black eyes as temporary tattoos. The worst of it wasn't the soot, it was the way the house breathed when the hearth came clean. The small sigh of relief you could almost hear, and knowing someone else would send a child next time, a boy small enough to slide where a grown chest cannot. I gave my pay to a boy with a face like a closed fist and told him to buy bread and not to climb chimneys. He climbed the next day for somebody else, of course. I have learned that charity does not always rearrange the world, but it warms your hand for a while. If chimneys were a bad joke, the match factory was the punchline the devil himself wrote. I took a turn there when my purse developed holes. White sticks, pretty as bones, dipped in a mixture that hissed and steamed like a disapproving ant. The girls sang to keep the time, their voices bright as bells, and if you had only your ears to guide you, you'd think the place was a festival. Then you'd see their teeth, and you'd stop wanting to laugh. The air tasted sweet in a way that felt like a trap. A girl named Eliza made me a crown of spent splints on my first day, and called me King of Sparks. And when she smiled, it was like a brave verdict. She taught me to keep my mouth closed when we stirred the paste, taught me to rinse my hands in vinegar like a superstitious priest, taught me the names of a dozen ways bones can ache. We're brighter than the sticks, she said, and she was right. When the bosses docked their pay for being late, the girls put on their shawls and walked out together, not as beggars, but as a river. I carried their pamphlets because paper was a kind of light I understood, and because standing beside courage is how you borrow some. The strike made the papers, and the city blinked as if it had seen daylight for the first time. Eliza pressed a matchbook into my palm when she returned to work under new terms, and I have carried it ever since, unstruck. It reminds me that sparks can be saved for better nights. I carried a pick next. They called us navvies, and we carved the land like stubborn sculptors who loved only straight lines. Canal cutting, then railway beds. The engineers arrived with their little rulers and their tidy maps, and we arrived with backs that spoke in a different grammar. The ground doesn't always agree with a ruler. We persuaded it with shovels, with sweat, with curses that bent like reeds and sometimes broke like twigs. We learned the handling of powder, black and sullen, learned to tamp it and step back and open our mouths for the shock. I lost a friend named Keene to a miscounted second and held his hat like it was a fragile egg. The beer tent at dusk was a cathedral, and our coins made the offering plate heavy. I slept on straw with a dozen other men and felt for a time like a nail driven into the continent with conviction. The first train I saw come thundering over our work made my eyes water with pride. I wouldn't have believed I could feel for a thing made of iron, but there it is. Pride sneaks up on you, so does grief. We named the cuts and embankments like children and left them standing when we moved on. And maybe that's a kind of fatherhood. Cole was a different father entirely. I went down because work paid better in the dark. and because I'd learned how to tie my fear to a post and walk away from it when there was coin at the end of the walk. The seam we followed was stingy. We crawled, shoulders and hips turning into hinges. The roof stooped like a miser. Our lamp stuttered. The air sometimes decided it was tired of participating. Fire damp, they said, and after damp, and other words that felt like polite names for an enemy. The littlest ones, the trappers, sat in blackness all day, opening and shutting doors to keep the air doing its endless chore. And I handed my bread to one who whistled to count the hours, and discovered he couldn't carry a tune, but carried persistence like a knight's shield. When the roof settled wrong, we all felt it in our knees first, then in the small hairs on our necks, then in the resounding persuasion of falling stone. We walked out single file one afternoon without speaking, as if we'd heard a sermon we all agreed with. On the surface, the light felt too loud. I lasted 2 months longer than my sense said I should, and left before the mine could keep a piece of me I'd miss. Work above ground felt suddenly luxurious. Rope walking under a high roof where the world stretched to the length of your patience. A rope walk is a long, narrow room that looks like a joke until you stand at one end and realize the far door is a rumor. We twisted hemp and manila until our hands could make rope in the dark by memory alone. Tar turned our skin the color of old ships. The rhythm in a rope walk is a softened heartbeat, a steadiness that makes your mind tidy. A man at the end called out the count like a poet who loved only numbers, and the strands climbed into each other without a quarrel. I learned that a good rope is a promise with a spine. I learned that most people don't notice the best tools until the tools fail, and the finest compliment you can pay a rope maker is to forget him entirely because nothing snapped. You'd think by now the world would have taught me caution. Instead, it taught me endurance and a taste for stories, which amounts to the same thing, only with better company. That's how I ended up on islands bright as bones, where birds wrote the sky with their wings and the ground crouched under guano like a field of snow that had lost its manners. The dust clung to everything. It changed our faces into masks and our shirts into declarations no one wanted to read. My eyes burned and my nose tried to resign. We scraped and shoveled and coughed and slept under canvas that smelled like the world's worst bakery. The foreman counted loads with a finger that trembled like an old clock. The pay was good, and the days were long, and the dignity came in small pieces, like the breeze that occasionally remembered us. I left with a cough that kept my ribs acquainted with one another, and a respect for birds that borders on religion. I tell you this, so you'll know that the worst jobs aren't a single corner of the map. They're a pattern on the whole cloth. You can be boiled by the sun, or drowned by the earth, or smothered by generosity that has turned sour. The shape changes. The lesson keeps returning. The body pays. The world looks away. You learn to look back at each other. There was a year when I became a knocker-up in mill towns that woke before dawn, thought to put on her face. I carried a long cane with a bit of wire at the end and a pocketful of dried peas for my blowpipe, and I learned which window belonged to which dreamer. 3 taps for Mr. Bell, or he'd claim he hadn't heard, a soft rattle for the woman with a baby, so the waking didn't break 2 lives at once. A fierce fusillade for the lad who'd drink his wages on Saturday and try to sleep through Monday, as if guilt had a snooze. It was, in its way, a return to the watchman's trade. I'd tried in the old city, except now the streets were new, and the smoke had opinions, and the factory hooters bellowed like disappointed giants. I liked the small power of it, the way people trusted me to carry morning to their windows. I liked less the way the mills did their own knocking, on the lungs and the bones and the thin thread that holds a person to their name. Tunnel work came next, because I hadn't yet learned all the shapes fear can take. We went under a river with air pressed into our heads, until our teeth felt like secrets trying to escape. They called us sandhogs in some places, which made us sound cheerier than we were. The chamber thrummed with the heartbeat of compressors. Talk felt like something you had to push across a table against a strong wind. We dug and braced and moved forward, one ring at a time, building a throat for the city to swallow its traffic in the years to come. You learn to love the discipline of sequences down there, because improvisation is how roofs decide to introduce themselves to floors with enthusiasm. We staged our exits so the bends didn't make a map of our joints. Even so, I stepped into sunlight too fast one evening and learned what it means to have the world nag your bones from the inside. I lay on my back in a cold room with a newspaper under my head and listened to my own blood argue with gravity. I went back the next day because there is a stubbornness that becomes you after a while, as fitted as a second skin. I have not told you about the hatters who gilded with mercury and learned to see ghosts where there weren't any. I have not told you about the gilders themselves who breathed in brightness and exhaled tremors, or the pearl button cutters whose lungs collected dust the way a wealthy man collects bad habits, or the glassworkers who stared into furnaces until the color of their sleep changed. I have not told you about the couriers who crossed mountain passes with messages no one dared speak aloud, or the slate splitters who turned stone into razors by asking nicely with a hammer, or the peat cutters who carved fuel from the old dead and stacked it into walls that could survive a gossip's hurricane. There are too many jobs to catalog, and even if I did, I would miss the worst one on your street because I wasn't there on the day it went from tolerable to cruel. If you're looking for a villain in all this, there are easier tales to read. I've met bad bosses and good ones, and folks who could be either depending on the weather. I've met men who made a sport of another man's fear, and women who held a whole roof up with a single look. The closest thing to a villain I can show you is a city's hunger for what it refuses to see. That, and the way necessity can dress up like choice and ask you to dance. The worst job, in every century I visited, is the one you cannot refuse. The best job, in any year, is the one where someone sees you doing it and understands that you are keeping the world from falling into its own mouth. I drifted back, as I tend to paper and letters, because they are easier to lift than stones and harder to regret than lies. The printer with the smiling eyes let me learn the dance of the composing stick, and I set words that smelled faintly of oil and future. We printed notices for meetings and pamphlets that argued with kings without raising their voices, calendars that made time feel tame, handbills for performances where people pretended to be other people until everyone felt a little freer. I watched a woman read her own name in a leaflet for the first time, and I watched the expression on her face as if a candle had decided to light itself without permission. I printed rules for factories that remembered they had workers and sometimes pretended to care. And I printed small books of recipes that turned poor kitchens into brave ones. I printed a 2-page broadsheet once with nothing on it but a list of trades and the names of people who held them, because I wanted to see whether a city would recognize itself in the mirror. Some laughed, some cried. One man paid for 10 copies and pasted them like badges on his walls. I went too, where words had not trespassed, to a yard where ships were birthed and died. I kept a tally for a breaker who could smell good timber under bad paint. Another worse job is taking apart what other men built, especially when you admire the skeleton. Salt and iron and rot make their own alliances. We levered planks off ribs and stacked them in bundles, and argued about whether a keel remembers the storms it survived. I rescued a handful of carved letters from a sternboard and nailed them to my door, as if a name could keep rain from choosing me for a visit. The breaker told me he liked the ending of things. "It's honest," he said. "No more pretending. No more coats of paint." I thought about that for a long while and didn't decide whether to envy him or be afraid. I promised an ending, and endings prefer to arrive when called. Here is mine, such as it is. On a Sunday, a real one, with bread and quiet, and a sky that had scrubbed its face clean, I walked back through the lanes of my own history. There was the alley where Hob had tied a rope around my waist and handed me a shovel with a look that said he knew what it meant to offer a man both humiliation and salvation at once. There was the marsh where Maeve had counted the bites on her calves like beads on a rosary and laughed at the sky with a mouth full of silt and courage. There was the tanner's yard where the smell rose like a choir from hell and made saints of us by accident. There was the breakwater where the ship that had been my home for a season had leaned against the horizon like a tired giant. There were chimneys and mills and rope walks and tracks and tunnels and doors that opened at 3 taps and doors the earth itself closed. I walked and I nodded to them, the way you nod to old teachers you've outlived, grateful, aware, unwilling to go back to school. In the afternoon I sat on a low wall with my onion in my pocket, because I have never learned not to carry small superstition with my competence, and I watched a boy and a girl argue tenderly about who had to take the worst shift at a laundry. The boy said he'd do it because he was less likely to cry when Lai found a cut. The girl said she'd do it because she knew the trick of turning grief into a song under her breath. They both laughed at themselves at the same moment, and the laugh braided around them like a rope spun from better days. I stood up and handed them the last of my bread and asked them whether they'd been taught the 3 rules. "What rules?" the boy said with the kind of suspicion that keeps you alive. "The rules I learned when I didn't know I was learning," I said, counting on my fingers. "Tie a rope when the dark asks you to come closer. Carry an onion when the world smells stronger than you think you can bear. Share your bread when your own hunger is louder than your manners. You'll find reasons for the rest as you go, but those 3 will be enough to keep you useful and human most days." They grinned because youth doesn't always need a sermon, but it enjoys a neat list. The girl tucked the bread under her arm like a ledger. The boy asked what I did now, and I told him the truth, which is that I try to notice. It's work, noticing. It doesn't pay much, except in the coin of sleep. That evening, I lit a candle I had dipped with my own hands long ago, and I set a composing stick, and I made a little page with big letters. A is for Ashler, the stonemason's block and the fellow who shapes it true. B is for Boatman. C is for Chandler. I let the alphabet walk the city and the fields at night, tapping at windows like a knocker-up with a pocket full of tenderness. I printed copies and handed them out until my fingers went black with ink again, and my heart felt cleaner for it. People smiled. Someone cried. A girl put hers up by her bed and used it to learn her letters, and when she came to G for Gong Farmer, she wrinkled her nose, and then she read the line again aloud, as if saying it could make the world bigger inside her chest. I don't believe there is an end to the list of worst jobs. The world invents new ones each time it solves an old problem with a new machine. There will be someone who scrapes the residue of a progress no one wants to admit, and someone else will, God willing, bring them a cup of clean water and a joke with a gentle punchline. The worst job may always be the one that keeps your name from reaching another person's tongue. The best part of any job is the moment your name returns to you, like a bird that hasn't forgotten the way home. I have lungs. I have legs. I have a pride that learned how to transform from dragon to house cat and back again as needed. I have friends with names like Hob and Maeve and Nell and Eliza and Long Tom and Keen, and a list of others that could fill a wall like a prayer. I have a rope coiled by the door and a lantern hung on a nail, because darkness is not the enemy, only a place where good work waits. I have an onion, of course, because superstition is just memory with jokes. And I have you, if you've followed me this far. Another pair of hands, another back that has learned the art of bending and straightening without breaking. Take the handle, lift with your legs, laugh when you can. Learn the name of the person next to you in the worst place you've ever been, and say it aloud until it belongs there less and less. When the morning comes, and it will, even if it has to be knocked into or step into it like a man or woman who knows that the world gets made and remade by the people who do the jobs no one is writing songs about. I won't sing, but I can promise you this. If there is dignity to be found, it is usually hiding under the smell, waiting for someone with good lungs to go fetch it.